Welcome to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Deer University, hosted by Bronson Strickland and Steve Damaris.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back, everyone, to the Deer University podcast. This is Bronson Strickland, and I am delighted to be joined by my friend and colleague and sometimes mentor, sometimes not, Steve Damaris. Steve, how are you?
Great, Bronson. It's always wonderful to work with you and for you and around you and just try to keep up.
Yeah, right.
Keep up.
So,
This
Steve,
is a fun. Well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in, but this is just a fun podcast for us.
I hope it is. It should be. It should be a lot of fun. And so we did a request. We actually did some finger pointing, if I remember correctly, with the little Instagram post that was made about asking questions. And our graduate student, Luke, really wanted us to squint and scowl and point and cajole. And I think you did more of the squinting and scowling than I did.
Well, you know, anybody that follows our social media, you're familiar with Luke Resop.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's motivational and enthusiastic, highly capable, all those things. And we give him a simple thing. Hey, let's put out a request for questions. I mean, he doesn't just put out a request for questions. He tasked us with he comes around, hey, let me take your picture. And I was out in the parking lot. And he says, I really want you to give me some attitude, like the old, I want you for savings bonds and whatever. Mm-hmm. And I gave him some attitude. Yeah. I took direction. My director said, give me some attitude. And he took my picture, and I said, so how's it look? And he said, oh, great. And he's just walking away from me, won't let me look at it. And lo and behold, it was...
it had attitude.
It had attitude in it. Yeah. Now, yours was a little happy face. I mean, you got a little happy face, like, hey.
Yeah. I wasn't telling people to give us questions. I was asking them. I was asking them politely.
Yes, and
that
kind of maybe goes back to our personality differences. You're the nice guy, and I'm the other guy.
Can be not so nice sometimes.
If we were police officers, partners,
cop,
you'd be the good cop all the time. I'd be the bad cop all the time.
Well, Steve, we got a bunch of questions. We have so many that we're going to have to break this up into at least 2 episodes and maybe 3. So what we decided to do, we would kind of theme this episode of all the questions that were related more to deer biology and behavior and buck movements, and then some of the relationships with hunting that go along with that. So I guess there's no better time than the present. We will just jump right in. So I will start with Matt. Matt's question, I don't see in here where he's from, but essentially, and people who wrote the questions, forgive me, I'm trying to condense down. Some people wrote a paragraph or 2. So I'm just trying to reduce it down to the actual question. But essentially, Matt is wanting to know about all things scrapes and rubs. So Steve, why don't you give us just a little bit of a review? I know you have a thought on how to handle this in terms of doing an entire episode related to it, but why don't until we get that episode done, why don't we just start with a little review of what scrapes and rubs are?
Okay. Well, scrapes and rubs are basically social media outreach by individual deer prior to the breeding season, leading up to it, and through the breeding season, and they're telling others within their population what's going on with them. And there's different, I don't want to get into details about what's a scrape versus a rub and all that, because his question here was, hey, can y'all do a podcast on all things scrapes and rubs? And I think that's great. Because it's a huge, complex question, and we've just wrapped up a year-long project in North Mississippi and South Tennessee where we were documenting scrape behavior, and we had 104 scrapes that we were monitoring from October through January, and we just have this massive database now that I don't think anybody's ever published, at least on this level of analysis of scraping behavior. And the number of social interactions and the number of bucks visiting individual scrapes, I think it's just like, wow, let's just do a whole podcast like Matt asked for, and we're going to give it to you, Matt.
We might need a little time to delve into that it's a lot of data, a lot of photos, and so our former student and now colleague Miranda, she is going through that right now, and that number of photos can be overwhelming. So it's going to take some time to parse that apart, and so bear with us, but we promise we will do an entire episode related
Absolutely.
to that topic.
And just a little bit of teaser, we think of, well, bucks do the scraping, and does will check out the scrapes when they're in estrus. Yeah, most of the visitations and the activities associated with the scrape were the bucks, but does were right up there in terms of a significant number of does were visiting the scrapes, and not just when they were in estrus.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we didn't have uniquely identified does, so it's hard to say how many times and how frequently in the space of visitation. But given the width of time the does were visiting, it's more than just during her estrus period. And we even had fawns visiting.
Mm-hmm.
And the does and the fawns, their most interest was focused on the licking branch, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
The bucks are all about licking branch. They're all about peeing on themselves and rubbing their legs together and pawing the ground. The does and the fawns, they were just kind of, hey, that licking branch smells pretty interesting. Let me stick my nose up there.
Yeah. So we were joking around the other day. We were thinking about some potential titles for this research, and I was calling a scrape as kind of like deer graffiti. And
yeah.
Kind of thinking back when you're going through, whatever town, and you'll see whatever the name is, was here, Tom was here, Jack was here, whatever. That's kind of part of the signpost communication of these bucks and deer, is they are leaving a chemical signal saying I was here, and then other deer are coming along and being able to see who was here. And then, of course, there's a lot more sophisticated pheromonal communication going on, and potentially estrus status, and not only who was here, when they were here, and we'll delve into all of that in the entire episode. But a lot of information, interesting information there with scrapes and rubs.
Yeah, and we didn't even worry about rubs. Well, maybe we should do that this year. Monitor some rubs with the cameras.
Hey, man, if you got the time, I got the cameras.
All right. We'll work on that. So our next person here, and these are not chronologically listed or whatever, we just grouped them by category. So Stryker, from who hunts the western part of South Carolina, and he's talking about seeing the buck-doe ratio and the age classes of bucks. And he said, I've noticed this year especially, which I guess was this past year, or maybe he's talking about this summer and early fall. This year especially, there have been a lot of fawns born later in the year than normal. And he says our rut in the area where I hunt is heaviest around the last 2 weeks of November. And so I want to kind of there's several questions and comments in here. I want to kind of break it out, and I want to say some things about that. Our fawning period was later this year than normal, and I'm going to try not to. I tend to be nitpicky and delve into details. And one of the things I like to try to talk about when we're talking about breeding dates is they don't change from year to year. A population breeding date is relatively stable. There's going to be some variation within the population as to when individual does breed, but the average breeding date, and then there's usually a range of breeding dates of about 40, I like to say 3 weeks before the peak of breeding and 3 weeks after the peak of breeding, that 48 days or 45-day period there. That's most of the breeding is going to take place during that period, and there's going to be this peak is going to be the peak from year to year to year, unless there's some huge change in population age structure, major changes in habitat quality, thus the nutrition. It's pretty stable from year to year. So the fact, Stryker, your observation that you're seeing later fawning, my personal opinion there, and I don't want to say you're wrong, but my personal experience and knowledge about breeding dates is this year isn't necessarily a 2-week later fawning period. I think what you're probably seeing is, well, it's what you're seeing, and hunters and landowners and those outdoor enthusiasts, we go out and we see stuff, but the sample size that we see is so small relative to the population that's out there, and we might see and stumble upon a few here and there hits and misses, and one year we see a few things, and then the next year we see a few things, and a few things on any given year is going to be not representative of what the whole population is doing. So my take on this, Stryker, is that there wasn't a 2-week shift in fawning dates and thus breeding dates, that you probably just saw some things this year that, based on the number of things you saw, would indicate a change to you. But if you saw enough things about really what's happening in the population, there wasn't a major shift in breeding dates and fawning dates.
And Steve, let me add on there just to let people know, because a lot of times when biologists are asked this, and you'll see it in articles we've written and other people with similar articles, we're pretty dogmatic. We're pretty secure in our viewpoint that the rut is not moving around 2 or 3 weeks up or back year in and year out. And this typically comes through the moon discussions every year. Particular moon, and the rut's going to be earlier or later. And the one reason we say this with such confidence is that year in and year out, when you sample does, and this has been done in Mississippi, just thousands and thousands of records, we can show this, and in other states as well, is that when we're able to harvest does in the springtime, and then you can examine the size of the fetus. Joe Hamilton's scale he developed many, many years ago, and we verified it with known breeding here in our deer pens. Deer from different regions, we verified that relationship, and that relationship was really, really strong. Is that we know essentially to the day or two, there could be a little variation there, but we know to the day or two when that doe was bred and conceived. And when you look at a particular site, year after year after year after year, on and on and on, there is very little, if any, change in the mean conception date, the average conception date on these properties. Mm-hmm. And that's just not here. That's in every state wildlife agency that's done this. You see the same thing over and over. And like you mentioned, there can always be an exception, but I would say it would be more of a catastrophic event would cause there to be a shift. I mean, just some huge environmental disaster like a flood or some change in habitat that really changed the physiological condition of the deer, something like that. But you're just never going to see a swing of 2 to 3 weeks in the peak of the rut on a property from year to year. So that's kind of the reason we say that with such conviction. So we just have so much data showing it.
Back to the sample size thing, if you see 3 or 4 animals out of a population, that those 3 or 4 could very easily have just be oddballs. But when you see 50 or 60 or 70 animals, like the kind of sample sizes we're talking, 150 samples from a population, there's a distinct, consistent peak.
Yeah.
Now, a couple of we just do a whole podcast just on this topic. A couple of early research projects back 30, 40 years ago. Dave Gwindit led a project in the East Coast. He was out of Clemson at the time, and they looked at a major shift in age and sex ratio, and going from shooting any buck and just having a really young buck age structure versus and an unbalanced sex ratio to a more balanced older bucks and a balanced sex ratio. I think they documented about a 30-day shift in breeding dates. That was a major population management change that led to that. And then some work I did with colleagues in Central Texas, Bob Cook and Gene Fox and others, where they had a terribly managed property that was purchased and then managed very effectively, major habitat improvements, major changes in grazing pressure of domestic livestock, basically took all the domestic livestock off, clearing brush, prescribed burning, and a huge population reduction in the white-tailed deer population, as well as a bunch of exotics, getting those off the property. We documented a 45-day shift in breeding and a huge concentration of breeding. Instead of breeding spread out over 3 months, we had that back down to 45-day ideal breeding dates and a 45-day shift earlier. So the deer were in much better shape. They were more consistently breeding when they should be breeding, not when they just happen to survive long enough and be in good enough shape to breed. So yes, you can shift breeding dates, but it takes a huge impact. Large-scale population, large-scale habitat, large-scale nutritional impacts can shift breeding dates. But the average place doesn't change much from year to year.
You rarely see that big of a swing from year to year. And so what y'all did was, through all of the management, population management, habitat management, etc., is you allowed the does to be in good physiological condition at the time they were genetically programmed to come into heat.
Yes.
So they didn't have to wait for their body condition to catch up. It was basically they're in sufficient physiological condition because of the management. And then when their genes and the hormonal processes told them it's time to come into heat, they came into heat.
Absolutely.
Hence the pig of the rut.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then related to follow-up
Steve,
question.
That's just the first part of that question.
Yeah, it's great stuff, Striker. Thank you for bringing all this stuff up. So next part was, with fawns being born in July and August, will that affect when that particular doe will come into estrus again? And this brings up Mike Dye's work that we supervised him in our deer research facility, and we pulled together a database from Mississippi State Deer Research Facility, and we looked at breeding records from the Kerr Wildlife Management Area. We even got some from the University of Georgia, courtesy Carl Mueller. And so we really looked at all these year-to-year known does, when did they fawn, and looked at consistency and patterns. And you're always nice enough to point out that I'm still learning things. And because I had this perception based on my experiences with individual deer in breeding pens that I was aware of, and I had this conception that, a doe is going to, year in, year out, going to breed plus or minus a few days, year in, year out,
Mm-hmm.
same time, because of some deer that I remembered that happened to have that pattern. And go ahead and expound on that problem with people that, like me, that have a perception.
You remembered the exception and not the rule. So you remembered a very few memorable instances where
Mm-hmm.
it conformed to your thinking,
Yeah.
to the rule you had made.
Yep. And we're all guilty of that.
Every
And
human being is guilty of it.
yes, and that ties back to the whole sample size thing. I had this perception of individual does that I remembered, well, so and so was always on the, July 6th, 7th, 8th, she fawned every year. And yes, she did. But when Mike gathered all this data from our research pens and Kerr and Georgia, you remember what they learned? What he learned?
I remember it was so we would call that interannual variability or interannual repeatability, but there was a lot more wiggle room from year to year within an individual
Mm-hmm.
over time, year after year
Yeah.
after year. And Steve, I don't remember the exact number, but I do want to say it was like plus or minus 8 or 9 or 10 days, and not
Mm-hmm.
plus or minus 1 or 2 days.
Yeah.
So there could be a couple week swing for an individual, but then when you've still plotted the population average, the peak for the population was consistent from
Yeah.
year to year.
Yep. And we looked and tying back to the whole nutritional availability and how that nutritional impact can affect animals. We did document that the time in which, or the duration of lactation and the number of fawns, does that brought fawns through full natural weaning tended to delay their breeding by about 5 days versus does that lost their fawns and didn't have that nutritional demand from and stress from lactation. And then
Mm-hmm.
these are research pens where full ration pellets are available in all the 3 facilities we used. But still, that demand of lactation, even though there's good food around, if the fawns were weaned naturally, or went basically three to 3.5 months of nursing, those does took a little while to recover and tended in that year breed a little bit later,
Mm-hmm.
5 days on average, compared to does that lost their fawns early. So there is variation.
Yeah, there is variation, but it's at the individual scale, not the
Yes,
population scale.
not the population, and we all have to be careful about. And Stryker, you now realize I've done the same thing that I was kind of fussing at you about earlier. You see a few things, and those are what you remember. And I did the same thing based on my earlier experiences with individual deer that I'd been associated with in our research facility. So.
Thank you for admitting it, Steve.
Yes, I'm. If nothing else, I'm as critical about myself as I am on others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so did that wrap that question up, Steve?
I think so. And Stryker gave us he said any information would be awesome. We've just given you a bunch of information.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Steve, next question is from Chuck Cole. Tate County, I'm going to assume Tate County, Mississippi. Is there paraphrasing here, is there a type of rack, the dimensions of it, that are going to make a buck more dominant than, say, bucks that are lower tiered? So if a buck, for example, he says, if a buck is a short-tined 8-pointer, and he's the primary buck, is that going to make him more dominant or less dominant?
And that kind of ties back to some quite a ways back research led by Randy DeYoung, our doctoral student here. And he looked at breeding success of bucks in our research pens in mixes of different ages of bucks. And now in the research pens, we cut the antlers off. So they just had, 1-inch stubs on both sides. So we looked at age and body mass and which better explained breeding success. And Randy's data analysis showed that 50% of the breeding success was explained by body mass, and age wasn't that big of a deal. And
well, they're so highly correlated.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the main driver analytically was the body mass, not necessarily the age. So Randy's analysis showing that 50% of the breeding success was related to body mass, which is tied to age. But to me, the other 50% that it didn't explain, age and body mass didn't explain 50% of the breeding success. And to me, that speaks a lot to something that we weren't able to document in that study was attitude.
Yeah, how aggressive they are.
Yeah, the aggressiveness of an individual buck, their personality. Some bucks are just going to be more aggressive than others.
Right. Coupled with that, it's what's kind of cool is we looked at this a lot of different ways over the years, and I'm remembering familiar with the research Randy did. But Phil Jones also led a kind of a follow-up study we did a number of years later and found the exact same thing, that the number one determinant was body weight. But the revealing thing with that study was that it changed over the duration of the rut. So from the beginning to the end, and so you think about just what you said, is those ones that were really successful, they're older, they're bigger, they're more aggressive, they also give out a gas. That aggression eventually starts taking its toll on them at a greater rate than does an equivalently sized buck, but he may have a more laid back attitude. And so you would see the bigger aggressive bucks were more successful earlier, but some of those that kind of laid back and, I'm not going to be a fighter, I'm going to bide my time and wait it out, they were very successful at the end. So, but it really was the single most important thing is body weight, and then your opportunities within there are aggression, your temper.
Yeah.
Do you want to fight?
And then Randy, and especially working with our colleague and friend Ken G in Oklahoma, the Noble Foundation, where he had a large 3,000 acre enclosure where he had years and years of known aged animals and looking at antler size related to breeding success and some other work that Randy did on the King Ranch. Basically showed that the average successful breeder was average antler sized.
Mm-hmm.
If bigger antlers don't necessarily guarantee more breeding success.
Right. Despite, so typically right here, Steve, people will come back, but y'all did this study where you controlled everything and put the big artificial antlers on one buck and put the peewee antlers on another buck, and the doe showed, but those are really kind of two different questions. So with that study where we manipulated the antlers, first of all, and I think the most important thing is does were judging the extremes. 160 inches of antler versus 80 inches of antler. Mm-hmm. And did they show a preference for one or the other? Well, the way I look at it, and your 2 cents, Steve, I just think that the antlers were a signal to the doe that is an older, mature buck. And so more often than not, she sidled up to him for a breeding opportunity. But then in the wild, when it really comes down to the bucks then having to sort it out amongst themselves about who is dominant, that other things come into play there, like the aggression, like the body weight, etc. So they're going to sort out in their hierarchy who's number one, number two, number three, and antlers rarely fall into that on the buck side of the equation. And then when it comes time to breed, the doe is breeding the one that is available and the one that is taking charge at that moment. Did that clear things up or make them more muddy?
Well, I'm going to throw in a little more confusion here too with some, the cool thing about science and analytical analyses and things we do, the more we look at, the more different complexities we tease out. And, so another analysis that you and Phil Jones have led with us is looking at kind of an optimum size of antlers. And it appears that there's an optimum size of antler here in Mississippi. And I think it has to do with the kind of an optimum. They want to have antlers as large as they need to have in order to fight and to have a signal to the female that I'm okay. And when you think about that fighting, it's to me it's a leveraging thing. So I think it was like 15 to 16 inch inside spread and about a 20 to 22 inch main beam length, if I remember correctly.
Yep, I remember specifically the beam length was 22 inches.
22 inches.
Yep.
So think about a fighting stance and a wrestler. If two wrestlers are going to face, they have their hands close in front of them. They don't have their hands out here trying to, grab the other guy and do this. They're in here because from when you're in it, and I'm not going to try to make a fighting stance here, but
please don't.
There's an optimum leveraging that is best. There's an optimal leveraging. I guess I won't get into the physics and all that about fulcrum length and all that those kind of things, but there's an optimum size for fighting.
Think about an NFL lineman, a guard or a tackle. They don't have their arms spread completely out trying to utilize leverage with their arms, all the way spread out. Their arms are in tight and in front of them, and that's where they have their power to try to move the other person around. So
that's right. Mm-hmm. And that's what two bucks that are fighting, they're trying to move the other guy, constantly twisting and turning them, and if you can turn your opponent, then you're now in charge and in control.
Yep, and that's what's important. So yeah, since you brought that analysis up, I think the way I have phrased it in the past, Steve, is that the data tell us that when you look at the relationship between body weight and antler size, that for say up until about 20 inches or 22 inches, when body weight increases, antler size increases with it. So when we look at that, it helps us think, or we believe that there is a correlation, a relationship that is advantageous in general to those bucks, that once my body gets bigger, my antlers are going to scale with them. Mm-hmm. But then you reach a point to where you reach that sufficient size. So it would be the point of diminishing returns. And so once you get to 23 or so inches, body weight continues to increase, but antler size, in this case beam length, does not. And so they've kind of reached that is good enough, and investing more into antlers at this point is wasting energy. Mm-hmm. I should be putting that energy in my body weight because I want to live, number one, and that body weight and leverage like we're talking about is more important to get breeding opportunities than having 2-inch longer beams. It's not doing anything for you.
And so now half of our listeners are right now thinking, yeah, but so why are there such really big antlers? Mm-hmm. And
well, they're very rare. That's not the average. That's the right tail of the distribution. So that's 1% of the bucks get those really, really large antlers. And we're not comparing whether they were successful breeders or not. You just know that buck got to maturity and grew 170, 80, 190 inches of antlers, you have no idea how many fawns he sired over his lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So I would wager a whole bunch of money that the average antler-sized buck that may have been a little above average body weight probably sired more fawns over his life.
And speaking of number of fawns sired, that was another of Randy's analyses, was looking at reproductive success. And he had some bucks we had data from, for 8 or 9 or 10 years. And so we really were able to look at breeding success of bucks and tie it back to their antler size. And it was surprising at that stage we were still learning a lot of new stuff. And Randy kind of classified 2 different types of bucks, or at least these are my terms, not Randy's. But there's the kind of the really successful, short-term successful breeders that flash in the pan. They bred and produced for a year or 2, and maybe bred 3 or 4 does successfully each year for 2 years, and then they were gone. And then there's another class of bucks that were not very successful or very effective, but they maybe bred 1 doe a year, but they did it for 6 or 7 years. Mm-hmm. And I call those the good dancers. They weren't a flash in the pan, boom, 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 breeding a bunch of does and being successful, but then they're gone. They kind of wore out, mm-hmm. Killed because of all their enthusiasm or whatnot. But then there's the guys that kind of hang back and they're going to breed a doe every year, maybe occasionally 2, but they're going to spread out that success over a longer time period. And so there's all these different patterns. And to say, well, they're going to always do this or always do that, that's why we like to say never and never say always. As soon as you say one thing that's always going to be driving a relationship, nope.
Yeah, yep. So it's almost like a tortoise versus a hare strategy.
Yep.
The hare is that super aggressive, he's wide open and is successful for the short term, a year or 2. But the tortoise maybe doesn't put forth that much effort. But who knows, maybe by not expending that much effort year in and year out, he lives longer, mm-hmm. and has more breeding opportunities. So I guess 2 different strategies, at least 2 different strategies there that bucks can use to sire fawns over their life. And one thing, I need to wrap up this question with Chuck here. Chuck, this was good, man. You got us talking. But I think looking at the very end of it, is he may be going towards, if you have what appears to be this super dominant buck, but he has little antlers, should you harvest him? Chuck uses the terminology, should you cull him out? And is another mature buck going to then fill in after that? And so, again, we'll get back to our, what is your purpose of culling? If you're, quote, culling him thinking you're going to make some type of genetic improvement by doing that, you're not. But if you're trying to create a void there for another buck, then by removing this 4 or 5 year old buck that has an 8-pointer and is short tined and has below average antler size, I would say go ahead and shoot him and make sausage out of him. And you are going to create, you're going to create space for another buck to occupy that area. Now, is it going to be above average antlers, average, below average? Who knows? There's no predicting that.
Nope. And I don't think there's going to be just like this huge space that some buck from a mile away is just going to come in and, hey, I'm going to fill this spot now. It's bucks that are kind of familiar with that space.
Yeah.
And you take one out, well, you're going to see another rise to the top there in terms of the dominant structure. But there was so many things we could talk about, but I'm going to take your lead and see how nice Bronson is. He didn't say, Steve, stop talking. He just said, we need to wrap this up.
I almost used my little Led Zeppelin line with you. Ramble on.
I thought that was Dream On, or no, that's another band's Dream
Yeah,
On.
that's another band.
Yeah, and I'm not going to start.
Please
being
don't. Please don't
Aerosmith here.
sing. Yeah.
Um,
All right, Jim Benton. Do you want to go with that question?
Yeah, I'll ask that and let you answer it. How about so, Jim? How does exotic flora density, and I'm thinking so exotic plants in the environment, how does the amount of exotic, competitive exotic plants in your environment affect deer and coyote relationships and behavior, and each species' respective populations?
Steve, much like Jerry Clower, in the story he tells, this question is so simple and obvious, I'm going to let you answer it. It's like Jerry Clower letting his chauffeur answer the question that time. So yeah, I think the question is essentially if you have at what level does exotic invasive vegetation going to affect your deer population? Specifically ask about deer and coyote relationship behavior. I have no idea regarding the interplay between deer and coyotes. I have no idea. So in that regard, Steve, I'll let you chime in. I would just say in general, though, that I hate to say it, but it depends. It's going to depend on the extent of the vegetation on your property or in your area. Some exotic vegetation may not be that harmful to deer habitat. Others can be catastrophic to deer habitat. So if you're on the Gulf Coast, for example, think about Kogon grass. If Kogon grass takes over a majority of the understory of your forest, you're in deep, deep, deep trouble. You're in deep trouble. But, there's always going to be some exotic vegetation species wherever you are at in North America. There are some exotics there. So I guess I would just qualify my answer with it's going to depend on the extent of the colonization, what proportion of the habitat is made up by this exotic vegetation, and how harmful it is. If it's not providing any food or any cover for deer, then that's going to be really bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the key, I have three points to make here. One is you've touched on if it's really a dominant species of vegetation on your property, excluding other species, which that's invasive species tend to be aggressive and exclude other things. And we talk a lot about building habitat. And if you build the right kind of habitat, which is generally going to be a diverse habitat, you're going to meet the needs nutritionally and cover of your deer population. So an invasive species comes in and dominates the vegetation community, you have changed the diversity from high to low, and that's not a good thing. It's going to typically drive down the nutritional intake of the population because you've gone to fewer species, and so the deer aren't able to find what they need when they need it. And a single species like Kogon grass you're talking about, which is a very low, doesn't provide much cover at all, and it provides no nutrition. So you've got a double whammy in that case. No cover and no nutrition. So you're hosed.
Scientific term there. You're hosed.
Yeah, you're hosed. So I think the bottom line is back to, I agree 100% with what you're saying. It depends on the extent, and some exotic vegetation species can provide reasonable nutrition. Some can provide cover, but if it's all one thing, that's never a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So some might say, so how can you have, an exotic species all over the landscape and it be bad? How can that be good? Well, I think of an example, and I'm not saying this is good necessarily, but do not think it has diminished deer populations whatsoever is look at Japanese honeysuckle in the southeast. That provides a tremendous amount of forage. I don't think it's the most preferred by any chance, but it is a reliable browse that is all throughout the southeastern landscape that deer use. So that just kind of, when we were talking about Kogon grass versus something like Japanese honeysuckle, one of them, not so bad. You might even, I hate to say good, I wish it weren't here, but it is here, and deer can benefit from it. But Kogon grass is just, and there's a lot of examples like that, but that's not good. And the more you have of that on your property, the worse your deer population is going to be.
Yeah, and part of the prevalence and dominance of an exotic species, a lot of times we can't do anything about it and fix it, but some of it is an historical effect of land management decisions as well. Kogon grass is spread probably up and down our highways when seed heads are stuck to heavy equipment that's worked on a property, and there's some Kogon grass there, and get the seeds in the treads, and they drive it down the highway, and the seeds fall off, and you end up with, highway distribution corridors of plants developing along the highway, and then seeds are further distributed down the road, and a lot of stuff going on there, a lot of different moving parts, but it comes down to nutritional effects, cover, and the dominance of that species. And if you've got a bad impact from dominance, poor nutrition, and inadequate cover, then Jim, you've got a lot of negative effects. The deer aren't going to be able to produce the number of fawns. The fawns that are produced are going to be more susceptible to coyote predation because of lack of fawning escape cover, hiding cover, and escape cover. So you're going to have problems with your deer-coyote relationships. But a well-managed population level habitat, in my mind, isn't going to have a coyote problem. If you have a coyote problem, you have something else that's driving or allowing those coyotes to be a problem.
Steve, we got to kick it into high gear here. You've got a hard break coming up, I know. So let's jump.
Well, let me point out, because you asked, I think you asked that one, so I'm going to ask from Wade. Hey, professors, I'd like to see a podcast dealing with the issues of heat stress and poor quality soils here in the lower coastal plain. And he owns some land in southeast Alabama and is dealing with the heat and naturally low quality soils, and historically that have currently land use changes over the last 30, 50, 60 years of, you have a high prevalence of low quality forages, plants growing on that landscape.
Mm-hmm.
That's.
Oh, so you're posing the question to me.
Yes, I am. I'm Wade's question. So what about a podcast dealing with this? And we have a colleague, former graduate MSU Deer Lab student, who just wrapped up a dissertation looking at heat stress and choices that deer make. Maybe we could get Jacob Dykes to come on with us sometime.
I'm sure he would be happy to. Yeah, but so there's kind of two parts to this question. We're talking about heat stress, and this is one thing, Steve, we have seen over the years with our Mississippi data is I believe you and others with MDWF&P thought we would see a really strong signal in the data from drought. Is that when body weights were down in the fall, it's it's got to be because of that drought that was in in August or September. And when we started looking at the data in like 30 years worth of data, year after year, looking at those body weights in the fall, what are the conditions during the summer, and the strongest signal year in, year out was heat. It wasn't the amount of rain. Now there's a correlation there, because a lot of times when you have long bouts of heat, you didn't have rain, but there are exceptions. But what we saw more often was the heat, and that really corresponds with livestock and just observations in general, could be in deer pens or whatever, is that when animals get really hot, they really don't want to move as much, they don't want to eat as much, and so they're going to go and find cover where they can hopefully, relatively speaking, thermoregulate and stay out of the hot sun. And that's kind of what Jacob was doing with looking at brush management in South Texas. And one of the things he's going to educate all of us about is that in that area of the country, all brush is not equal. And so there are some configurations of brush that are more optimal for thermoregulation, and can air move through it? Can deer cool down? And so that's, I guess, the biggest deal I would say on the heat stress part, is that we believe, at least at the MSU Deer Lab, we believe, yes, it's real. And the way I would try to combat that is just making sure with my habitat management, I have areas where, and this is generally not a problem, because in the southeast we grow trees, and trees cast shade. But just making sure you have areas where that deer can be in the shade, and that where wind can move through the stand to cool their body. And we need to do a little more research on that. Now, as for poor quality soils, that can be a little bit tricky, because we tend to just blame the soil for everything. It's bad soil, therefore it's bad deer. But what is missing in there is the vehicle that gets nutrients in deer. And that vehicle is plants. And so if you're in the South Mississippi, South Alabama, and forest is probably going to be, but probably pine forest is going to be the primary land use, it really all depends on how that forest is managed, is going to affect how much food is produced in that forest, which is going to affect deer quality on your property. So Steve, you and I have shown a graphic for my dissertation many years ago, where we correlated the proportion of the property that was in closed canopy pine forests. It's not just that it's pine, it's that it's closed canopy pine forest. And I remember just that beautiful regression, that collection of points followed a line. The more you increase the proportion of your property in closed canopy pine forests, antler size went down, down, down. It corresponded with it perfectly. Has nothing to do with the pine tree. It has everything to do with sunlight. So the way the pines are managed in that system for that purpose of generating income from pine trees, from the pine forest, the unfortunate consequence of that is that those tree canopies are capturing all of the light. No sun is reaching the forest floor, meaning there are no plants for deer. Along with that, there can also be potentially some challenges because of the soil. And so it's a more complicated story than just saying, I have poor soil, therefore deer quality is going to be low. You have to factor into the equation, do deer have plants that they can eat? And if you have, I guess I'll toss it to you, Steve. I'll wrap up with this. I would rather manage a property that had poor, quote, air quote here, poor soils, where I could manage the herbaceous community, than a property that was in, quote, good soils, where sunlight is not hitting the ground and I can't grow deer plants. I think I'm going to win as a manager in poor soils, where I can manage for forbs and manage for the herbaceous community and use fire, etc. I think I'm going to win.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%, Bronson. And we've shown with a good bit of our work down in the lower coastal plain with mid-rotation management And yeah, these more pines you have, more of the problem, kind of an inherent problem with that closed canopy. But when you thin the pines, if you manage them effectively using traditional timber stand improvement methods, including fire, but also once you thin, if you can control that low quality brush that is prevalent in that lower coastal plain underneath the pine tree. So if you thin the pine trees and you still have a heavy mid-story of low quality browse, that's still not going to help, because the browse was there before the trees were thinned, and they're going to be there after the trees are thinned, and there's still no good quality forage. So it comes back to those plants that you were talking about, and sometimes we have to use some selective herbicides to remove the undesirable plants. And a lot of hunters and landowners think, well, I don't want to kill plants, I want to grow plants, but you got to use a selective herbicide and the right timing of fire in combination to customize and produce the habitat quality and that diversity that we talk so much about, plant diversity, so that the deer can find the forages that they want, and you get rid of the low quality browse and make room for sunlight to reach lower, and with the promotion of fire and scarification of the seeds and getting rid of the duff layer of the pine needles, you open up a lot of growing space for high quality forbs.
All right.
So I guess so. What I try to teach our forestry students when they're in my classroom is, pines are not necessarily a great thing in some situations, but just because you have pines, if you can manage those pines, I jump in with I'd rather have a bunch of pine trees growing on my land that I can then manage effectively, as opposed to some closed canopy hardwoods that I can't do anything with because there's no market for the hardwoods to be harvested, and I can't do anything with it.
Yeah. I think I had a couple incomplete thoughts in retrospect there. I kept talking about just the pine trees. It has nothing to do with whether it's a pine or a hardwood. It's a property of the canopy is closed.
Yes.
So to a deer, it does not matter if it's a pine tree, a sweet gum, or an oak tree for that matter. You get the benefit of some mass with the oak tree, but the bottom line is, whatever the tree canopy is, if it's closed and intercepting all the light, you are across the board in bad shape.
Yeah. You know what, buddy? We haven't even gotten through page 1 of about 15 pages of questions.
We're doomed.
But yeah, I guess the good news here is that we'll have a lot more podcasts based on these series of questions.
Yeah. All right, let's make a push here to get through these last 4 or 5 questions here. So, Steve, this is from Brian Peterson, and it is regarding, I believe he is in Nebraska, and it is about velvet casting time frames and what are going to be the triggers for velvet shedding. So we talked earlier about the rut. How about what are the triggers for velvet shedding, and do you have any observations maybe in the past, Steve? And maybe you remember the memorable observations from individual bucks that have helped you form an opinion here on their timing and the repeatability of velvet shedding.
Yeah, I have had some memorable examples of bucks that they shed their velvet the same time year in, year out. And I think there's less going on in terms of fewer moving parts with bucks and their velvet shedding, because they don't have this big, huge thing called gestation and lactation associated with the does. And I think maybe will prove me wrong here, but I think I'm going to say that velvet shedding is more consistent from year to year than a breeding date would be for an individual deer, and that the population is still going to be pretty darn consistent at the population level, large numbers, that they're going to be shedding their velvet. The peak of velvet shedding is going to be the same year in, year out.
Sounds like something we could test, though.
Yes.
We need to take a closer look.
Yes, and so maybe we'll do some additional analyses. I know we've talked about how we could do a couple of different approaches to that, and maybe we'll follow up and have somebody working on that.
Yep, I think that's a good idea.
So, so back to the kind of the overall controlling thing, and a lot of people have heard about photoperiod, and photoperiod is just the ratio of light to dark, and short days, long nights, long days, short nights, being short days, long nights during the wintertime, and summertime is long days, shorter nights, and that transition into shorter days and longer nights, and that relative ratio of those is what we refer to as changes in photoperiod that kind of help time patterns of physiological processes in wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are they set the parameters, and then within those parameters, nutritional condition of individuals can affect how their expression falls out in a given year. But I think within a population of bucks, their pattern is going to be much less variable than a doe. Still controlled generally by photoperiod, but because there's not as much to get in the way of a buck's nutritional condition like there is for the doe, I think those bucks are going to be more consistent from year to year. So do we want to jump into Mike talking about the deer rutting at the end of November? And he doesn't give a location here, but given the time frame, when would you say fawns are fully on their feet and following mom versus hiding alone? And Mike likes to drive a tractor and does things on his tractor, and he's worried about making sure he doesn't run over or detrimentally disturb fawns. But he wants to get his tractor work done well in advance of hunting season. So how long should he wait after peak fawning time before he gets on his tractor? Because he doesn't want to run over. Those young fawns, they're in a hiding behavior. They're not going to jump up and run away for the certain amount of time after birth. What do you think? What do you think there?
Well, we're going to have peak breeding there end of November. So we're going to have to just make some assumptions here with some very easy math. So let's just say that the breeding is completed by November. Very, very little breeding in December. If we then look at the gestation, that is right at 7 months. And so that means fawn should be on the ground in June. And again, there's going to be a window. That's a population average. Some are born a little bit earlier, some are a little bit later. And then after those fawns are born, I'm thinking, Steve, you need to give them at least 3 weeks to a month before they can really start responding to a stimulus like a person or a tractor or whatever, where a fawn is going to be able to get up and run. So you may really want to hold off on doing any bush hogging. You probably want to wait until August. Okay. So you got June is when fawns are on the ground. Let's give them all of July, and then let's do our mowing in August. What do you think?
I would agree with that. I think, several weeks of hiding behavior, and I think I've got rambling in the past about talking about how neonate fawns actually turn off their heart rate and their breathing rate in response to predator stimulus, and that's a really cool phenomenon. That's the extreme hiding phase, when they're just a few days up to a week old. You literally can't jump them out of your their hiding spot. They're going to stay, and if a tractor's coming, they're going to run that baby over, and nothing you can do about it. And they get further and further developed, and that hiding behavior becomes less restrictive because their muscles are developing and they're able to avoid the tractor or whatever, certainly by a month. And if you give them another month just to make sure that they're going to be out of the way and following mom, I think, 2 months they're going to be with mom and not a concern at all.
Okay. Let's go to, I don't have a name here, but it's Greenway 27. I've noticed in southwest Georgia that the overwhelming majority of our bucks make substantial antler increases until 3.5. After 3.5, I typically see very small increases. For example, only about 5 inches increase year after year. Been fortunate enough to hunt on the property where the bucks can live a long time. Maybe it's the TV shows, but I feel like Midwest bucks make huge antler size increases after 3.5 years old. You want to start with that one, or do you want me to jump in?
Well, we can talk about a lot of data that's been collected by us and also our colleagues in South Texas, and looking at growth rates of bucks based on known age bucks and repeated data, and following same bucks year in, year out, looking at these rates of growth. And I think 6 years of age is going to be the sweet spot for peak antler development. And by 3 years of age, just looking at averages, I think you're around 65 to 70% of your maximum antler size by 3 years of age. So you still have a pretty good chunk. Say you're at 70%, you still have another 30% to grow. Mm-hmm. And now, but the rate of increase per year is starting to decrease dramatically, because it's going to be another 3 years before you're maxed out. So you get 70% of your growth in 3 years, and then 30% of your growth the next 3 years. So the annual increment is going to be smaller for the next 3 years. But if you're a real connoisseur of antlers, it's not just the size, it's the characteristics, and those older bucks are going to really start doing some interesting things. So maybe the antlers aren't quite adding on that incremental increase. A proportional increase isn't there, but you come up with some pretty interesting things at 6 and 7 years of age.
Oh yeah, mass, splits, stickers, drops, all those little things that make antlers interesting. That magic is typically happening after 5 years of age. So, yeah, I guess I'll just jump in and add in, Steve. I completely agree. That's exactly what our data show, is that I guess I would call it the rate of increase is a lot steeper. They really are at accelerated growth until about 3.5, and then from 3 to 4 and 4 to 5, etc. It's more shallow. The gain they're making from year to year is less and less at that point. But one little interesting dynamic we have here in Mississippi, just because we have an ag region, and then, from the previous question, when you go to our southern part of the state, that's mainly forest management in that area, southern Mississippi, is that the rate of growth is a lot steeper in our Delta region. So it's like they get to maximum antler size sooner than we see in the southern part of the state. So in our Delta region, they're at like 95+% of their maximum by 4.5 in the Delta. But when you get down into the lower coastal plain area, it is basically just a linear growth pattern, not this curved with diminishing return, just like this linear growth pattern until 6 or 7. So just less food is available, and they just grow at a lesser rate, and how they get there.
Yeah, and I guess I'll refer to my admission earlier about being misperceived based on a few samples here and there. Sometimes I uh, misconstrue, and we're talking, I think it was Stryker earlier, about things that he had seen maybe needed more sample size, and I think Greenway 27, I'd say, don't believe everything you see on a TV show, uh, and they're going to show you a very small number of animals, and they may say that the deer is this the year old, and they don't usually know just how old the deer is. If they do, then it's in a highly controlled situation, and maybe not representative of what would be happening in the wild. Uh, I'm not poo-pooing deer hunting shows. I'm just saying don't necessarily believe everything you see on a hunting show and generalize from what you see.
Well, let's phrase it like this, because this is really what I think is going on. Is that's an exceptional buck. And so a lot of the lingo, Steve, might be, we've had this buck on film for several years, and then he, quote, blew up this year, added 20 inches of antler, from 4 to 5 or something like that. Well, again, just looping it back to what you just said, yeah, I have no doubt that individual buck did that. Heck, you've got photographic evidence showing that that buck did that, but that's not the population average. That's an instance, that's an individual, and that individual was obviously very special. You know how I know that? Because he made it on TV.
Yeah.
That's why he was special. So we don't have all those other 3, 4, and 5-year-old bucks that followed the normal pattern, because nothing was really special about them to make it on a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question is from Tim Connor. Scouting today, and I was wondering why old rubs are, well, old rubs. Do bucks tend to rub on different trees each year? I've never really observed that they hit the same trees year after year.
Well,
I haven't either.
I have seen some trees that have evidence of year after year after year rubbing behavior, and I've had some landowners say, yeah, that tree right there has been a rub on that tree for years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they do keep coming back to certain trees, but there's also always new trees that are going to be rubbed on in a given year, and they may not become one of the favorite trees. They may just grow out of being used.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
And I've seen some of those. I mean, that's not the norm by any stretch, but I have seen a couple of those in person as well. It's usually a bigger diameter tree as well. It's never on a little sapling or seedling. It's a bigger diameter tree. And I think, Steve, a lot of it might just be based on its position, where it's located. It might just be that it's in a real prominent travel corridor, and the rub is just serving as a signpost, like we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And it's just going to be it's deer graffiti. And so other deer are going to walk by it, notice it. It's in the ideal location. They're going to rub on it as well. And because it's an older, larger diameter tree, the tree lives from year to year, and you see the scarring on it from year to year. How often that occurs, how frequently this occurs, I honestly have no idea. But I certainly know it does occur.
I would guess just generally that there's going to be a bunch of trees used just for a year or two, and then they're not going to be used again.
Right.
Because there's thousands, some properties have hundreds or thousands of trees per acre, and they're not going to be rubbing on every single tree. Mm-hmm. They might change one tree to another from year to year. And
right.
Again, it's just like, what are you seeing? And are you remembering the uniqueness, or are you remembering the average? And we tend to remember the memorable things.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steve, this is our last question.
One last question from Bryce, and this is one last question under the biology and behavior. We still have buck movement. We've got a whole list of questions, but the last one for today is from Bryce Sharp. When someone says peak rut, what are they actually referring to? Buck searching or actual breeding time? And boy, that's a great question to end on.
Mm-hmm.
You want to take a whack at it first?
Yeah, I have actually asked that clarifying question to people before. Is I'll follow up with, well, what exactly are you referring to? Are you referring to buck behavior, buck observations while hunting, or are you asking, is the peak of the rut when the most does are conceived? I think, Steve, the way we kind of parse it up is we call the peak of the rut peak of conception, when the breedings are taking place. But we fully acknowledge, from a buck movement standpoint, and in terms of what we're probably going to see with the scrape study we're working on, and certainly from hunters, what they're seeing, when they are detecting, meaning hunters here, when they are detecting peak observations, is probably the pre-rut, the week or two before peak breeding is likely what they're thinking is the peak of the rut. But peak conceptions are probably 1 to 2 weeks after peak observations.
Yeah, that early rut, there's a lot of excitement in the air and a lot of signpost activity, but not a lot of breeding. But once the breeding's taking place, they're not rubbing trees and making scrapes so much they're chasing does.
Yeah. So the pre-rut bucks are searching. That's why you're seeing them. They're covering ground. They're looking for the earliest does coming into estrus. But when you get into the peak, that is when they've located those does. And the courtship behavior, and they're sticking with them for 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. Forming that tending bond, and that's generally when you don't see as many bucks while you're hunting. Is during the
Speaking
peak
of
conception.
bonds,
yeah,
let's wrap up with the bond concept. We are bonded, and we really appreciate the bond between our information sharing and our listeners. And we've had some great questions today, and we really appreciate everyone, Stryker and Matt and Tim and Chuck and Brian and others that have sent us some questions, some great questions. Got us rambling a little more than maybe we needed to, or at least I probably did.
Well, Steve, by now they know that's what they signed up for. We tend to ramble, and by we I mean you.
Yeah. Well,
sorry, I had to have one last little jab in there.
That's good. That's a good place to be.
Yep. Okay, Steve, thanks a bunch. I had a lot of fun, and this is the first of several of these to come. So we'll have another 2 or maybe 3 episodes answering these questions. So thanks to you, and thanks to everyone that wrote in. We appreciate it.
Take care, and good scouting, good hunting coming up.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.